Agenda Spezial, the politics podcast that goes into depth, published by Der Tagesspiegel.
The COVID-19 pandemic poses an urgent challenge to our global food systems, threatening to plunge countries with unstable economies and dense populations into humanitarian catastrophes. In June of this year, Tagesspiegel hosted the World Food Convention Digital Edition 2020, calling upon the global community to act to ensure that the current health crisis does not plunge at-risk countries into even deeper crises of poverty and hunger. At the center of this flashpoint are smallholder farms. From India to Egypt to the Americas and across the African continent, about 2/3 of the world's 3 billion rural people live on about 475 million small farm households. Most are families, farming plots smaller than 2 hectares each. Many are poor and food insecure, yet smallholder farms actually produce food for a substantial portion of the world's population. Today we're going to be talking about smallholder farms focusing on Africa and what conditions look like for them during the current coronavirus crisis and what lies ahead. With us today is Adrian van der Knaap, Managing Director of the Farm to Market Alliance. The Farm to Market Alliance is a public-private sector consortium focused on empowering smallholder farmers to become reliable market players through access to 4 integrated pathways: predictable markets, affordable finance, technologies and quality inputs, and handling and storage solutions. Prior to the Farm to Market Alliance, Mr. van der Knaap was Deputy Regional Director for East Africa of the World Food Programme. He was in charge of supply chain and support services, and his work with the World Food Project has brought him to the Middle East and Africa. He is an expert in post-harvest loss, logistics and supply chain, and emergency management. Welcome to the program, Mr. van der Knaap.
Thank you very much.
We're focusing on Kenya with this particular edition of the podcast, and we're talking about the living reality in Kenya during the corona crisis. What impact did the corona crisis have on the living conditions and political stability in Kenya?
The impact, apart from the health impact, the economic impact you can see. There's a lot of people have not the jobs anymore that they had before. Tourism has more or less disappeared, apart from the local tourism, but the international tourism has disappeared. I know that some of the export market in fruit, vegetables, and flowers, etc., has been affected also, although I see it gradually coming back online. So Kenya has taken an enormous hit because some of those foreign currency earners like tourism and an export of cash crops to Europe, the Middle East, etc., has been heavily affected. And there's many people in Nairobi, especially in the urban area in general, that rely on all sort of jobs, and they don't have a replacement necessarily, or they don't have a safety net to replace the income that they have from their day-to-day labor.
Your focus is on smallholder farms, or a lot of your work is with smallholder farming. What was the impact to living conditions for smallholder farms in both Nairobi and Kenya? Were food prices affected?
Yeah. I think that if you live in an urban area and you don't have a regular job, your income is affected. Funny to say, a lot of people went back to the families in the rural areas because at least you have probably food. Now, we've seen disruptions in supply chain and transport. It was difficult for some of the rural areas to access market in more urban areas, etc. But we started assessing it, and while the report is not out yet, we looked at markets, we looked at liquidity, we looked at productivity, we looked at inputs provision, etc. And there's some funny things popping up that actually in Kenya and Uganda, we think that in some of those value chains, like maize and beans and sorghum, we think the productivity went up. We also saw that the input providers like seeds, crop protection, fertilizer, they sold actually over the last months far more than they did last year. But at the same time, we see there's very serious market disruptions, and there's also very serious disruption in the availability of liquidity in the market, meaning the loans, small loans for farmers and small agri-businesses has taken an enormous hit. So on one side, we have indications that productivity went up. On the other side, we have indications that market access became very difficult because of all sorts of disruptions in logistics. Maybe the purchase power of people went down also. And we saw liquidity disappearing. That is very interesting. And someone said, and I don't know if that's true, someone said the fact that a lot of people living in the urban areas went back to their families in the rural areas, that might have given an enormous boost to productivity in general.
What I've learned about smallholder farmers is that they tend to be experts at crisis management. Years of coping with a succession of other crises, from cyclones to floods to drought to the Ebola crisis, civil wars. They've taught them, I think, more than most how to deal with a disaster. But this pandemic is a bit different, isn't it? It's proving to sort of turn everything on its head, from supply chain to value chains. What do small farmers need to do in the long and short term to get through this crisis and become reliable market players?
Just on the crisis itself, one of the main things that I think we haven't measured that can have an enormous effect is actually the health. Because if it affects in general older people more, and the older people, the average age of the smallholder farmer, that is the main owner or the main driver, etc., mostly men, but sometimes also women, is 60, 62. So the health crisis can have an impact on those families. The vulnerability for a smallholder farmer is, yes, the weather, yes, predictable market, yes, access to finance, but it's also that a lot of them do not have access to proper health insurance, or they don't have health insurance. So that means if the breadwinner of the family falls sick, priority will be to pay the hospital bills or the medicines, etc. And that means money that they have to invest in seeds and fertilizers is not available. So I think that in general, it is already a major point of vulnerability for the smallholder farmers. And I think now, because the crisis is in the urban areas, same as a bit in other countries, but now it starts spreading to the rural areas. And I think this can be devastating for them, because certainly the breadwinner might be more affected than the younger ones, and that will have a very negative effect. So that is for the pandemic. In general, on the smallholder farmers, I see the whole value chain of building a rocket. And if you build a rocket, even the smallest element that is wrong can cause that rocket to explode. So the trick with building a rocket is that you have a good concept and design, but every small detail has to be taken care of. And this is the vulnerability from the value chain. We know that seeds have to be available, or that mechanization has to be available, or credit needs to be available, or market needs to be available. But there's a lot of different variabilities that makes the value chain for the smallholder farmers so difficult. And I think we often overlook those small variables that can cause it for a negative effect for the farmer. Just think of it like you have a bucket with water, and the water that you put in the bucket, that's your investment. Now, if you have big holes in the bucket, that's obvious. You fix those holes, and there can be liquidity, that can be access to market, etc. But even if there's a small hole that you won't notice, if you come the next day, your bucket is empty. Because there are small holes that are not obvious, you haven't seen them, you haven't paid attention to it. But after a while, that small hole causes all your investment. And I'm talking about the investment that the smallholder farmer himself or herself does in the farm. Because if they buy seeds or fertilizer, or they have to access labor, etc., these are all investments that they do in the farm. And that is also a bit the story of FDMA. We said we have to look at all aspects of that value chain. Because if we don't do that, and we miss some small items, they can cause all the investment to disappear, and then you don't have progress. And I can give you a small example of that one, because maybe it's a bit theoretical. We had in a certain area in Kenia, we were doing quite well with certain crops and the market, etc. And there was a certain area that didn't do very well. And according to the figures, they had invested in the fertilizer, they had invested in seeds, they had invested in crop protection, etc. So we started digging a little bit deeper. And at a certain moment, it came out with conversations in the field, because we were standing with the sorghum field, we saw all those birds. And I said, because sorghum sticks out. I don't know if you know sorghum millet is very, very vulnerable to birds. And the better the crop is, the more birds you attract. They know very well what best crop to pick. No? So we were standing there and discussing this, and then we saw the birds and said, what about those birds? I said, that's a big problem, they said. I said, how do you mean it's a big problem? What does it mean? He said, well, we can lose 10 to 25% of our yield. And sometimes one year is worse than another year. And they said this year was actually quite bad. So some people lost up to a quarter of their yield to the birds. So you try to find this one in all the policy documents of the value chain. Nobody's mentioning that, but it was evident for us. And I said, but you never raised this. I said, we've never heard this from you guys. And they say, yeah, no, it's just how it is. This is how nature is. We just live with it, etc. I said, well, but it doesn't mean we can't find a remedy against it. And by the way, scarecrows in Africa doesn't work. Birds here they are a bit tougher and maybe a bit more clever. What works in Holland, that doesn't work here. So anyway, but we said, but we have to find a solution for it, because if you can lose up to a quarter of your food, and said that means all your profit, all your investment has been, there was no return on investment.
Right.
So this is an example of one of those small variables that we look at all the aspects of the value chain. And if we see a gap or a problem, we said, okay, how can we solve that? And how can that be solved in general? And that is often, those small ones are often overlooked.
Good. That's a nice way to sort of get to my next question, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about how the Farm to Market Alliance operates? As you say, you're looking at these small elements that often get overlooked in larger policy reports and larger data gathering efforts. But what are the other things that the Farm to Market Alliance does, and structure-wise, to help smallholder farmers and the agribusiness in general?
So on the macro level, because we have two objectives, and you mentioned that in your introduction. Yeah, we want to increase the income resilience of the farmer through commercially sustainable building value chains. So looking at that, if we see a marketable surplus of a farmer, even if it's small, the next step is where is then the market? Can we come up with a predictable market? So that's the two pillars. And if we have that, then we're going to see where are those gaps in the value chain, the logistics service provision or liquidity, or the right seeds and crop protection is not available, etc. And then we try to attract mainly commercial companies to invest in that value chain, invest their time, their efforts, etc. We don't pay them, they don't pay us. Yeah? So we don't do it ourselves, but we try to find mainly private sector partners who can come in, who see a promise of a value chain, and who are crucial to play along because we need them for mechanization or whatever. So that's on the macro level. Now, how does that work on the micro? This is macro. How does that work on the micro level? For the food crops like maize, sorghum, beans, soya beans, etc., we have what we call a model, the Farmer Service Center, which is a big name, but it's actually, this is the entity that is there for the farmer. I call it also, let's say, a commercial extension worker. The smallholder farmers often do not get the right advice. They don't know often where to buy the right stuff, or where is their market, or where can I get mechanization or information about credit, etc., etc. So our model is, we call that the Farmer Service Center. In Kenia is a 1 or 2 person business. They have 200-300 farmers in their portfolio, and they help them with access to inputs. They help them with access to market. They help them with access to credit or to insurance. And they get a commission, not from the farmers, but they get a commission from the companies that either sell to or buy from. And that is, on the micro level, they are our eyes and ears to the farmers.
What sort of measures is the Alliance taking to overcome the challenges of the Corona crisis towards the food sector and the agricultural market specifically?
We are having a proposal. It's more or less finalized with some of our partners, because we saw as the main problem is the liquidity for the coming planting. And I said, if the liquidity will not be coming back, then we can expect the productivity that we have seen now increase, probably decrease very strongly next year, February, March, with already in a situation that Kenia, specifically on Kenia, have to import already large quantities of main food crops. Now, next year, with the heavy hit they got on the economy, it will be more difficult. So we think it's incredibly important to bring liquidity back in the market. So our proposal is, and we have more or less, we are lobbying now with both private and public sector, is that if we can guarantee, if we can come up with a guarantee fund, can we get commercial credit from the commercial lenders, the banks or etc. Can we get them back with a certain promise that we have a guarantee fund for a certain percentage? We also work together in those value chains, etc., etc. So we are trying to entice the commercial banks in Kenya to invest part of the money into those value chains, the small agri-businesses and the farmers. So that proposal, we have done that, and now we are lobbying with, on the public side, donors to provide us with a guarantee fund. And on the private side, we are lobbying with banks. And we do that partly together with the Rabobank, who's one of the members in the alliance.
Mm-hmm. Do some of these measures incorporate the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals? Is that a part of the proposals that the Alliance is trying to set forth with these lobbies?
Very much so. It's on a very high end. What we do, whether it's on the regular program or now with the COVID-19, that fits all very neatly in the SDGs in general. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the access to food and etc. So that is almost a given that is on the basis of all the work we do. Sustainability, right. The farmers, we look very much on the gender issues. I mean, 60% of our agri-businesses and farmers we work with, actually more the agri-businesses, are actually women. So that with that SDG lens is always there.
A lot of countries are implementing digitization in response to the pandemic, especially tracking infections, tracking testing modules. How can data collection and monitoring help to mitigate potential impacts of these kinds of crises on local food systems going forward?
I think the digitalization of those value chains is crucial. It's crucial because what I just mentioned, that it's all those variables. If you have a lot of data, you know where it comes from, whatever, you can monitor and analyze much more than we do now. But it's also a bit the holy grail. Everyone talks about that they want to digitalize the agribusiness, the ecosystem of the agriculture value chain. And it is incredibly difficult. Why is it difficult? Because for me, the end point and the start point is that farmer. Now, that farmer is in many cases not a smartphone. Yeah, sometimes they have a future phone, but in most cases they just have a cell phone. Now, I said, how can we make a one-stop shop for that smallholder farmer? That with the cell phone he can access all. He can sell, he can buy, he can get credit, he can get insurance, he can have access to information, etc., etc. And still make sure that there's a certain data protection level. And that's what we're working on with some of our members. But it's a bit the holy grail. The one, if we succeed, we as the different players, in digitalizing, speeding up the digitalization of those agriculture value chain, a lot of things like what I said, designing that rocket and looking at all the small details will become much easier. Apart from the fact that it can be also lead to lower prices for the inputs the farmer buy and higher prices for the market access. Apart from that one, we need it. If you overwhelm, someone said, okay, why don't we give the farmer a small tablet? Connectivity in Kenya is in generally quite good, even in the rural areas. And a tablet with all the different apps and whatever. I said, you don't, the few farmers I have seen that have a smartphone, they're already overwhelmed. But now is this app and there's this app and everyone they promised. They said, no, we need to have a one-stop shop that they can buy, they can sell, they can get credit, they can do everything on a cell phone. And part of the system we have, so what we're trying to do now is to create a momentum of enough partners that wants to build together that digital ecosystem.
I know that Kenya has set up a COVID-19 food systems war room basically, that generates information feeding into the national planning and response processes. So the COVID-19 Food Systems War Room is Kenya's response to create a better understanding of its country's vulnerabilities. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Is that a useful technology for smallholder farmers in Kenya? And what ways can it help them?
Okay, the war room is very much on the high level, that the government and major partners, that they see what is happening, like what I just said, the productivity and liquidity. We feed a lot of information in them via World Food Programme, who sits in that war room, so to say. And we get a lot of information back from them. So that is incredibly important. On the other hand, Kenya has the M-Pesa system. I don't know if you're familiar with M-Pesa, mobile money platform, which it's so advanced here. Some things are here. It's much easier to do than in Europe. Yeah, with your mobile, and that is the technology that we partly use to give access to financial instruments for those farmers. So, in general, the war room is incredibly important on a macro level to understand what do we all see happening, and how can we analyze that, and what we can do. So we're not just running around like chicken without heads, but there is a very strong coordinated mechanism. It's headed by the Ministry of Agriculture, with all the partners that feed in that situation and provides also information to all the players like the commercial sector, but also the public sector, the NGOs, the UN agencies. So I think that is enormously important. What we have to do now, and what is gradually happening, is coming up with action plans. Because if that information doesn't lead to, and for us, it's liquidity. How can we get liquidity back in those markets? There's also an issue that market access, the big food processors are nervous about the market, that purchase power is less. If they stop buying, so there's a lot of things now that we have to action. What are we going to do with? And for us, with some of our members, is that we have to make sure that all the inputs are there. We can do that with our members like Bayer and Yara and Syngenta, but we have to bring that liquidity back because we see that as one of the bottlenecks. So our proposal, what we're lobbying now for, is one of the actions. And there's other organizations with other things, but it's good to have a war room, but at a certain point you have to fight the battle. You know, war room is planning and strategizing, but it has to lead to action. Otherwise, it doesn't lead to results, of course.
This has been the Agenda podcast with our guest Adrian van der Knaap from Farm to Market Alliance. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Agenda Special, the politics podcast that goes into depth. More information at www.agenda-podcast.de.